Hello and welcome to the SHRM Labs Workplace Tech Spotlight. My name is Trevor Schachner, a product manager at SHRM Labs, and I'll be your host for this new SHRM Labs series where we shine a spotlight on some of the most interesting future of work innovators, innovations, and issues of today. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping and some general announcements. The Workplace Tech community is now available for all SHRM members. This is your guide to all things HR technology. If you're a SHRM member, please visit workplacetechcommunity.shrm.org to learn more. For those of you watching on LinkedIn or other social media platforms, please share this live stream and tag SHRM. You can use the hashtags SHRM Labs and WorkplaceTech. Really excited about today's topic. We're going to be talking about leading with vulnerability. In today's world where change is constant, vulnerability has emerged as a key ingredient for leadership success. It's not just about being open, it's about using that openness to inspire and drive performance, create trust, and unlock the full potential of teams. But leading with vulnerability isn't the same as simply being vulnerable. And I'm super excited today to have Jacob Morgan, 5 times best-selling author, futurist, and keynote speaker on leadership, employee experience, and the future of work. Jacob, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, do you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do?
Sure. So 15 years ago, actually 16 years ago now, I had terrible jobs working for other people. I graduated from the University of California, Santa Cruz with honors. I double majored in economics and psychology. And my idea was that after graduating from college, I would go work for a company, climb that corporate ladder, go back, maybe get my MBA, and perhaps be the marketing at an organization like an IBM or a Coca-Cola. So that was mentally where I was headed. So my first job out of college, I was promised I was going to be doing all these really amazing things and meeting with executives and entrepreneurs and really making an impact. And I had a 3-hour daily commute, hour and a half to work, hour and a half back from work. But I still took the job because I was promised that I would be doing all these really cool things. And so a couple months into my job, I'm doing data entry and cold calling and PowerPoint presentations. And the pivotal moment for me came when one day the CEO comes out of his beautiful corner office in downtown Los Angeles, and he's screaming from across the office. And he's like, "Jacob, I got something really important for you. I need your help. Get over here." And so I ran over to the CEO thinking that, finally my time has come. I paid my dues. And he puts his hand in his pocket. He takes out his wallet, hands me a $10 bill, and says, "I'm late for a meeting. I need you to go down to Starbucks and get me a cup of coffee." And at that moment, a light switch went off in my brain. And I say off because I was originally very excited to be there. And after that moment, the light switch went off, the bulb dimmed. I became disengaged, disenfranchised with the corporate world. And I was thinking, this is why I went to school. This is what I double majored for, is to go get you coffee. And ever since then, I've been off on my own. And for the last more than the past decade, I've been writing about and exploring themes around leadership, the future of work and employee experience, and how to create leaders that we actually want to work with and for, how to create organizations where we actually want to show up each day, and how do we create engaged employees. So I speak, I write books, I create content, and I have a lot of fun doing all this stuff.
That's great, Jacob, and appreciate you sharing that story. I mean, what a pivotal moment for you, and obviously it brings us together now, which I'm super excited about. So, to switch topics into kind of the topic of today, which is leading with vulnerability. Curious to ask you, and get your insight. Why is being vulnerable at work, a potential harm to your career? Why could it actually hurt you instead of help you?
Yeah, this has been a very big theme over the past many years, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about vulnerability. Brené Brown obviously pioneered a lot of the concepts that introduced vulnerability. And one of the things that I learned, so I came at this topic from a personal lens and a professional lens. Now, from the personal side, my parents were raised in the former USSR, so the Republic of Georgia to be exact. And I grew up, my mom trying to be emotionally vulnerable and, talking about feelings and stuff like that. My dad was the exact opposite. My dad was very much, don't talk about your problems, your emotions, your feelings. Nobody cares. Always try to be number one. Don't admit mistakes. Like very traditional, masculine and macho, what you might see in a lot of corporate leaders today. And so I grew up believing that vulnerability was dumb. It didn't make sense for somebody like me. And so a couple of years ago, I'm standing in my bathroom brushing my teeth, and all of a sudden I start to feel really weird. And my heart starts beating. It's like 130, 140 beats per minute, just standing there. My vision gets blurry, and I'm overcome with this fear of like panic or dread. Long story short, what ended up happening is I was having a series of panic attacks. And after talking to a therapist, it became very clear that what was causing these panic attacks was the fact that I had written or committed to writing a book about vulnerability when I myself did not believe in vulnerability. And so that really changed my perception and lens on what vulnerability means. And, we can talk more about that in a minute. Then there was the professional side. So the professional side is when I was interviewing a lot of executives, even for my previous book, The Future Leader, I talked to 140 CEOs and surveyed 14,000 employees. And the theme of emotional intelligence was coming up a lot, specifically vulnerability. And so for this new book, I talked to 100 CEOs, also surveyed 14,000 employees. But as I was having conversations with these executives, they were telling me that two challenges that they were faced with. The first is that vulnerability in your personal life is not the same as it is in your work life. In your personal life, it's very clear why you can and should be vulnerable with your spouse, your significant other, your friends, your husband, wife, whatever. At work, it's a different dynamic. You have a boss, you have employees, you have deadlines, you have projects, you have customers, you have the issue of salary. People are dependent on you. You are dependent on other people. And so simply being vulnerable it's not quite the same. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The second thing that a lot of these executives were saying is that vulnerability for me as a leader is not the same as it is for somebody who's not a leader, right? Because I am actually responsible for these people. I'm responsible for the dollars and cents of the business. So I can't just be vulnerable the same way that, Joe in accounting, who's only been here for a year or so, can be vulnerable. And this led me to the conclusion that purely being vulnerable can actually hurt you far more than it can help you. So let's talk about what vulnerability specifically means. Now, in the context of work, for most people, vulnerability is about exposing a gap that you have, a gap in maybe experience, a gap in emotion, a gap in competence. It's about exposing a gap that you have. Now, imagine, right? You show up to work every day and you're constantly talking about the gaps that you have. Right. So, for example, let's imagine you're at an organization, you're a leader of a team, and somebody comes to you and they say, "Hey, I know you gave me this really big project to work on. I messed it up. I'm so sorry I messed it up." No leader is going to sit there and think, "Well, gee, thank you so much for telling me that you screwed up this big project." And the leader is mind. They want to know, what are you going to do about it? The customer is still unhappy. The project is still not done. The product has still not been shipped. So vulnerability is just about exposing the gaps that you have. In the context of work, that doesn't help you. What does help you is when you expose the gap that you have and demonstrate what you're trying to do to close the gap. So in that same situation, instead of saying, "Hey, I'm so sorry, I really made this mistake," you add the leadership piece, which is now, here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. Here's 3 things that I'm going to do to make sure that that mistake never happens again. So this is why I tell people, simply being vulnerable and talking about all the gaps that you have, especially in the context of work, is not going to serve you and it's not going to help your team. Now, it's great that you feel safe to talk about those things, but whenever vulnerability is present, I always encourage people to think about how you can add that level of leadership. I made a mistake. Here's what I learned. I don't know how to do something. Here's how I'm going to figure it out. I'm struggling. I'm having a tough day. Here's some things that I'm going to do to try to improve and get better. Right? Always try to think about how you can add that leadership piece in there, because leading with vulnerability is about 2 components. The 2 most important things that a leader is supposed to do: competence and connection. Be good at your job, connect with your people. You can't just do one of those things, which is what we've been really, really focused on over the past few years, is just connecting with people and forgetting about leadership.
Absolutely. And what a great point about that clear difference between being vulnerable and then actually leading with vulnerability. I'd love to dive a little bit deeper. You mentioned competence, but
Yep.
really curious in your mind and your expertise, what's the relationship between being vulnerable and competence?
There was actually some really interesting research done by Elliot Aronson, and he actually used to teach at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I went to school. And he came up with this concept called the pratfall effect. And he was one of the people that I interviewed for my book as well. He's quoted in there. And one of the things that he found is that if you are very competent, you're good at your job, right? By all objective or subjective metrics, you're good at your job. People know that you're good at your job. And now you're vulnerable. Now you talk about mistakes. Now you're okay to talk about challenges and things like that. You get an added boost in likability and perception, because people view you as already being very competent. And now that you're talking about the mistakes and challenges and stuff like that, now people view you as, oh, this person's human. Like now we can relate to them. Now we can connect with them. So you get that added boost, right? The higher perception of being a high quality leader, a higher perception of being likable and competent. However, the flip side of that is also true. Let's say you are not competent. You're not good at your job by any subjective or objective metrics. And now you're vulnerable. Now you're talking about your gaps, your mistakes, your challenges, your failures, all that sort of stuff. What that does is that simply reinforces your mediocrity. And so if you're not good at your job and you keep showing up to work talking about all your vulnerabilities, people are going to look at you and they're going to say, yeah, I get why you're not getting promoted. I get why you were stuck in that role for the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So vulnerability, when combined with competence, can be extremely powerful for your leadership success and progression. Vulnerability on its own, consistently without competence, can actually really hurt you. And this is why the most important thing for people to do is to combine leadership with vulnerability, competence with connection. And I think especially over the past few years, we've really over-indexed on the vulnerability piece, which, again, vulnerability is not bad, but we've gotten so much in that direction that we have collectively forgotten the importance of performance, of competence, of being good at your job, of really understanding the fundamental relationship between an employee and an employer, right? I mean, you still need to show up every day to do what you have to do. And you cannot use vulnerability as a way to justify poor performance. And again, I cannot stress that enough. Competence and connection, they have to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. And what a great connection point to the HR people watching. I mean, you're in the business of people and understanding, the employees that are coming in that might have gaps and aren't showing them, but also those that are performing well and starting to show vulnerability. It's a really great way to understand, how the people and leaders in your organization are actually working. So great connection point there to HR people. Curious to learn a little bit more, why is leadership with vulnerability important for growth, development, and especially leadership through some kind of change in the organization?
Yeah, it's huge. When a lot of people hear the title Leading with Vulnerability, they might think it's a book about vulnerability, but it's really a leadership book. And when we think about how to lead through change, how to unlock the potential of those around you, how to create trust or drive performance, it cannot be done without leading with vulnerability. So we have to remember, again, those two pieces, and I call this the vulnerable leader equation. Leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. The definition of a vulnerable leader is a leader who intentionally opens themselves up to the potential of emotional harm. It's the vulnerability piece, but while taking action to create a positive outcome when possible. That's the leadership piece. So you're opening up yourself to the potential of emotional harm, but you're also taking action to create a positive outcome when you can. So why is this important for anything and everything? Well, first of all, you cannot get better without vulnerability, because again, vulnerability is about acknowledging a gap that you have. If you don't acknowledge any gaps that you have, you're basically saying, I'm perfect the way I am. I don't need to learn. I don't need to grow. I don't need to develop. I don't think there's anybody on planet Earth who would agree with that statement. I think everybody acknowledges that you do need to learn and grow and get better in all aspects of your life, whether you're talking about your personal relationships or whether you're talking about how you show up to work every day. So vulnerability is about that acknowledgement. The competence and the leadership piece is about what you do with it, right? So it's one thing to just acknowledge things and to talk about things, but you need to do something about it. So for example, you show up to work each day and you keep saying, I don't know how to do this, or I need help. Well, at a certain point, you're going to need to figure things out. You're going to need to figure out how to solve that problem. You're going to need to figure out, who do I go to get help? How can I help myself? And this is why it's so crucial when it comes to unlocking the potential of others and leading through change, because it combines the acknowledgement that you need to improve with the actual act of improving. Simply acknowledging that you need to get better doesn't really do much. We see this in our personal lives all the time. I mean, how many friends do we all have who say, I'm trying to eat healthier. I'm trying to lose weight. I'm trying to stop smoking. And it's great that you acknowledge that. But the next step is, well, what are you going to do about it? I've had lots of friends and relationships in my life where people would say, hey, I'm trying to really eat healthier. And I would say, that's awesome. what are you doing about it? Right? What are you doing about it? And if you don't focus on also adding the action piece to the acknowledgement piece, then what's the point? So again, those two elements go hand in hand, acknowledging the gap and then actually doing something to show that you are closing that gap. And this is ultimately what creates connection with your team, right? That's what the vulnerability does. It creates trust. It allows you to collectively move forward, to learn new things, especially in a rapidly changing world. How are you supposed to adapt? How are you supposed to discover new opportunities or mitigate threats? Well, you have to talk about the gaps that are there and talk about some of the potential things that you're going to do to close those gaps on a personal and professional level, and also on an organizational level. And so you cannot progress, you cannot develop without that. One of the CEOs I interviewed, Art DeGuse, he's the CEO, former CEO of Synopsys, big technology company. And he gave me this really great analogy. And he said, today, everybody is version N of themselves, right? You're the present day version of yourself. But the idea is that you want to become version N+1 version of yourself, right? So you kind of like the way that you upgrade the software on your computer or your phone. You get new updates, and then it's like version N+1, version 1.2, 1.3. So you constantly want to become that next version of yourself. Now, let's say you don't do that. And let's say, because some people might be saying, well, why do I need to do that? Let's say you're stuck at the version N version of yourself today. Now, the world around you is going to keep changing. Meanwhile, you're stuck at that present version of yourself. And so over time, what's going to happen is by default, you will become version N- of yourself, because you're stuck where you are and everything else around you is changing. And as soon as you get into that minus category, you are no longer leading effectively. You are no longer connecting with your people. You are no longer able to deliver on the goals of the business. And so then you get in a lot of trouble. So everybody needs to become the version N+1 version of themselves. Ideally, version N+300, 400, 500, right? Keep growing, developing. You can't do that without leading with vulnerability.
Absolutely. Again, another fantastic point. And on this show, we always speak about technology and innovation and change.
Yep.
And this is such a good message for HR people to hear that even if a new technology is scary, you don't understand it. It's that opportunity to go to the N+1, right? It's you right now. You don't understand the technology, but accepting that and moving forward and learning, educating and upskilling in that way. So what a great takeaway for HR.
Especially in the technology-driven world, right? Leading with vulnerability has never been more crucial. And again, I just want to stress for everybody, vulnerability plus leadership. Whenever you are confronted with some sort of vulnerability, try to ask yourself, how can I add the leadership? How can I add the competence piece to that equation? Because what's going to happen is you're going to change the perception of how people see you. And one of the big mistakes that I see all the time is for first-time leaders. And so imagine, right? I mean, you've been an individual contributor for many years. Now you're a first-time leader. And what do we always tell first-time leaders after they get promoted? We say, all right, go address the team. Why don't you say a couple of words to your team? You just got promoted. And how many times do we hear first-time leaders go in front of their team and they'll say something like, hey, I'm so excited to be leading this team. I've never done this before, but I appreciate your vote in me, your confidence in me. I know we're going to make an amazing impact. We're going to do really great things together. And I'm so excited to be leading this team going forward. Now, on the surface, it doesn't sound like a terrible message, right? You were vulnerable. You acknowledged you'd never done this before. You talked about some good things, but nobody who hears that message is going to walk away saying, oh, I am so glad that this person's my leader. They look like they got everything under control. That was just a vulnerable message. So how can you spin that into a message where it's leading with vulnerability? So maybe you turn that around and you say, hey, I've never done this before. I'm so excited to be leading this team to help make sure that I'm the best leader that you've ever had. Here are a couple of things that I'm going to be doing. Number one, I've asked one of the executives at this organization to coach and mentor me. And I'm going to be meeting with her once every 2 weeks, and we're going to be going over my progress. Number two is getting an executive coach. And this executive coach is going to be meeting with me. This coach is going to be talking to some of you and getting some feedback on how I'm doing. Number three, here are a couple books that I'm reading about leadership. I encourage you to get these books as well and to follow along. And please give me your feedback as we go through this relationship together so that I can be the best leader that you've ever had. Now, all of a sudden, the message is different. Yeah, I was vulnerable. I've acknowledged I've never done this before. But now I'm showing you that I'm taking steps to close that gap, to get better. And so now the perception is going to be, wow, well, I know this person said they've never done this before, but they are really taking this seriously. Like, I'm excited to be working for this kind of a person, like somebody who's really invested in their growth and development. And I'm going to invest in my growth and development too. So it's really it's a small but very impactful change. And if people are able to do this, they will find that they'll get promoted quicker, they'll get the opportunities quicker, they'll create better relationships in their personal and their professional lives, and they'll become better and more effective leaders.
Absolutely, Jacob. I know we're coming up on time, so I'd love to turn it over to you to let the audience know, where they could find some valuable resources. I know you have a new book. I'd love to just give you a chance to plug yourself and all the great work that you're doing.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there are a couple places where people can go if they want to connect with me. So first, I like to give my email in case people have questions, and that's jacob@thefutureorganization.com. We created a special URL for the book, which is leadwithvulnerability.com, where you could just type in Leading with Vulnerability in Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or wherever you want to go for that. And you can grab a copy there. I have a Substack where I share insights and research on leadership trends. That's greatleadership.substack.com. And then my personal website where people can connect with me on social and get access to the podcast and whatnot is thefutureorganization.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for being here. We really appreciate your time and, sharing the great insights that you have with our audience.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you everybody for joining today's live stream. If you enjoyed, please share it using the hashtags SHRM Labs, WorkplaceTech, and SHRM. You can always visit shrmlabs.com to stay up to date and make sure that you don't miss an upcoming event. We'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.